he had to come here tonight with a very strong line on that, and he did that. So I think he thought that he could continue in that vein. The audience just wouldn't let him, though, and they really were engaging with him, just not in a way that I think he particularly enjoyed. And by the end of it, it was really bad-tempered exchanges. You could see him getting exasperated.
Yeah.
You could feel the tension in the room.
To our top story, and for the last 2 hours, the leaders of the Conservatives, Labour, the SNP and the Lib Dems have been subjecting themselves to questions from a studio audience in York in the BBC's Panorama election special. Rishi Sunak, Sir Keir Starmer, John Swinney and Sir Ed Davey were each given half an hour to answer questions on subjects like climate change, broken promises, Scottish independence, productivity, integrity, hospital waiting lists, migration, etc. So how did they do? What emerged? Let's head over to the spin room right now where Times Radio's indefatigable, dynamic political editor Kate McCann is standing by. Kate, I love it when you're on. How do you feel it went?
Well, I mean, anybody who watched it, particularly the end there for Rishi Sunak, will know that it was a really bad-tempered end to this 2-hour session with the four main party leaders. It started off pretty slowly, the SNP and the Liberal Democrats taking a number of different questions. None of them really got the better of either leader. Both of them made their policy pitches to the audience, who were interested but not massively engaged, it has to be said. I think things ramped up slightly with Sir Keir Starmer, the Labour leader. He got into a bit of difficulty on the issue of Jeremy Corbyn and his previous record, and also on some of the tax questions. I think there were a bit of back and forth about whether or not the Labour leader was answering questions fully. We've seen him do that in debates before. We can come back to talk about that in a bit more detail, but it was really the final half an hour with the Prime Minister where, you know, for me, it felt like the audience just genuinely wanted to give Rishi Sunak a bit of a kicking. Every single question was a really hostile one. And in fact, the first question to Rishi Sunak, you know, it was so hostile. He was asked whether he was embarrassed to be leading the party into the election. It actually made people laugh here in the spin room because the Prime Minister said, well, good evening, everyone, almost as if to say, well, don't let me get into this gently. So, yeah, really bad-tempered session that last half an hour.
Well, what do you think of the way in which he tried to distinguish himself from the Liz Truss period? Because I thought he did that more explicitly this time, and he seems to be doing this, and maybe there's advice to him which says, look, you have to defend your record, but you've also got to distance yourself from what Liz Truss did more powerfully.
Yeah, it's a really good point. I think both leaders, both of the Labour and Tory leaders, had a bit of a difficult one when it came to their previous support or lack of support for their predecessors. So taking Sunak first, he has said this before, he's used this line before, which is that I have previously warned that Liz Truss was not a good idea. I used the leadership election to say that her economic policies didn't stack up. And in fact, he did do that consistently all the way through. Although, you know, ultimately he lost to Liz Truss, he did maintain that position, and it wasn't popular at the time. It made him unpopular with his own party for saying it. I think the fact, you're right, that he's reaching for it again now is a way to show, you know, it's him trying to say I'm different, but the reason he's having to do that is because we've seen this question of trust rear its head again, largely in relation to this betting thing today, the idea that you know, Tory candidates and others have been betting on the date of the election. There's a growing sense of, you know, us versus them, one rule for them, one rule for everybody else, and that's something he's trying to tackle in distancing himself from Liz Truss. But it's also, you know, it's the same question has been put to Keir Starmer too about his previous support for Jeremy Corbyn. You know, it's a different thing because Starmer did campaign for Corbyn when Jeremy Corbyn was leading the party, but it still puts them in a difficult position, doesn't it? It's that kind of party versus government versus country question, and they both have to try and find a way to navigate it. Yeah,
and Kate, watching the debate, I thought that all four men struggled to connect with the audience, and you compare it with Farage, whatever you think of him and how he comes across, he does much more easily. What do you think about that, and who do you think was most under pressure when it came to trying to show they could connect with an audience?
Yeah, it's interesting that you mentioned Nigel Farage because he did come up. Fiona Bruce said, well, there will be a point when Nigel Farage is questioned as well. He will also be given his opportunity. And a lot of the audience, there was a ripple of sort of giggles and a few smiles and a few sort of raised eyebrows. And she actually commented on it and said, oh, it's interesting your reaction in the room because he does elicit that kind of excitement, that little bit of, oh, I wonder what's going to happen there. I think it's fair to say that the leaders did connect, but perhaps not in the way they wanted. That last half an hour with Rishi Sunak, it became increasingly bad-tempered from all sides. I think initially Sunak thought that he might be able to ride it out by explaining himself, and he did hold his hands up. He gave a very robust answer, I thought, on this betting question, and he said that not only will those people involved, if they have done anything wrong, face the full force of the law, he said, quote, "I will make sure they are booted out of the Conservative Party." So, that he had to come here tonight with a very strong line on that, and he did that. So I think he thought that he could continue in that vein. The audience just wouldn't let him, though, and they really were engaging with him, just not in a way that I think he particularly enjoyed. And by the end of it, it was really bad-tempered exchanges. You could see him getting exasperated.
Yeah.
You could feel the tension in the room. I think the big one for me is the Labour leader, because Keir Starmer has struggled in the past with answering questions, not quite answering them, giving very long explanations for things, not really connecting. And I think he did that again tonight. He made that same mistake of taking too much time and not getting to the point. And Fiona Bruce actually pulled him up on that a couple of times.
Yeah, and what about Sir Ed Davey, the Lib Dem leader? Because he was asked whether he was proud of his role with the Horizon scandal and his lack of support for Alan Bates and the sub-postmasters. And if I were him, I think, given how close we are to the election date and authenticity is key, I would have just said, no, I'm not proud, but I was lied to, and this is what I should have done differently. But he didn't. And that disconnect, that is an example of it, wouldn't you say?
It's really interesting that you've picked up on that. So I was watching the face of the person who asked the question when he was listening to Ed Davey answer about whether he was proud of his record on the post office. And I think it's fair to say that he wasn't convinced by it either. I think Ed Davey did as good a job as a politician can really do in that situation. He said, "I did make two big mistakes," and he used that exact phraseology.
Yeah.
So even admitting you've made mistakes as a politician is fairly unusual. And he did say, "I wish I'd seen through that." Now, he was pushed by Fiona Bruce, who said, well, maybe you just weren't curious enough, because there were other MPs in the Commons at the time who did do a lot more, and they did push back when they were told it was all fine. And I think he looked a bit uncomfortable then. It was a difficult moment for him. But I think he did have a well-prepared answer, knowing that question would come up. I think the other moment in the debate where someone had a well-prepared answer for a difficult question was Keir Starmer on the Rosie Duffield question.
Oh, yes.
He was asked wasn't he, about, well, Rosie Duffield said only women have a cervix, and you previously said that you didn't think that was right. Now you've gone back on it. And the woman who asked the question said, how do I know I can trust you on this stuff? He started off by saying, I agree with what Tony Blair said the other day, which I'm not sure is
That was not a great start.
Maybe the best way, maybe not the best start. But I did think actually his answer in the round, was fairly honest. He said, at the time when I answered that question, I felt that the debate had become very toxic. And it's why I answered that question, because I felt that trans people were being discriminated against, put in a really hard position, and I didn't want to make it worse. I think the difficulty for him is that if he calls himself a pragmatic politician, that means you are someone who thinks through a problem, you come to an answer and you settle on it. What that particular example shows is somebody who did the opposite of that, who was swayed by the debate at the time, and I think that's what that questioner was getting at, the trust and the question of solidity as a politician, if you like.
Mm-hmm. And Kate, we're going to talk to the SNP shortly, and I note that John Swinney, the leader of the SNP, the First Minister at Holyrood, was there. How do you think he came across? Because they're expected to get, let me use that Obama phrase, a shellacking in a couple of weeks' time.
Yeah, he had a reasonably easy ride of it, largely because I think a lot of voters recognise that they will not be able to vote SNP. There were a couple of questions about independence and some interestingly timed clapping, actually, that he got a really big applause for when he said Scotland would be better off if it were independent. And he made an argument for that. He had said, well, Ireland is better off, and there are other smaller countries who can do this, why can we not do this? And I think the audience seemed to warm to that. But I do think, they also were clapping because he was saying things like the Tory government will be a disaster. I thought on that point he was asked a really difficult question. I banked that one if I get to interview him too. He was asked, who would essentially make the better government? Would it be Labour or Tories? And he ultimately said Labour would, because he said the Tories would be a disaster. And it's interesting because the SNP never want to have to say that they think Labour are a good thing, because obviously there's the competition element. But I think in terms of the warm-up acts, if you like, of Ed Davey and John Swinney, it was much less tense in the room. There was much more willingness to maybe listen and engage, as opposed to with the other two.
A few WhatsApps and texts have come through. This is one from David in Ealing. David says he's had to sit out the question time. He's not happy with Fiona Bruce. He says the debate isn't flowing. It's too frustrating. And he says something nice about me. Thank you, David. And then this is from another listener. You rightly talk about disconnect. Why do we have politicians who use bizarre language like, quote, I will fight with every sinew of my being? What can you tell us about the way in which politicians present themselves to the people? Because some really do struggle.
Well, I'll tell you what, Henry, I can do one better, because I'm joined now by Bim Afolami, who's the Economic Secretary to the Treasury. So I will put your question directly to Bim. And the question, Bim, was why do politicians present themselves in a way that makes them feel disconnected from the public? This is from one of our listeners who says that some of the language that politicians use, it's not the kind of stuff you'd hear in daily life. Why do politicians do that, do you think?
Brilliant question. I'd say there are two main reasons. The first is that politicians spend a lot of their time looking at legislation, and that has sort of legalese and all these language that isn't used in ordinary life, and it's difficult, I think, for some politicians to get out of that and then get into real world again. I think that's what happens. And the second is that journalists spend a lot of time asking politicians technical questions about important things. That's their job. But that often means that as politicians are desperately trying not to be inaccurate, they end up using very technical language. For what it's worth, I always try and speak in common sense language, and I'm sure the listeners will be a judge of whether I've succeeded at the end of this interview.
They definitely will. I suppose the heart of that question is about how connected you can be to your audience. How well do you think Rishi Sunak did that tonight? Because I think all of us would acknowledge it was a pretty hostile lot of questions that he got. Do you think he managed to connect with people on that level?
This evening was the best performance I've seen of Rishi Sunak in a very long time.
You don't think he got a bit frustrated?
No, I think he was strong, and I think he was tough, and I think he was doing another thing that people accuse politicians of not doing, which is they say, well, politicians are never straight up, they're never honest about what they believe, they're never clear. Compare Rishi Sunak's performance to Keir Starmer's. He had to be asked again and again about Jeremy Corbyn and why he seemed to be saying something different before when he wanted the job of the leader of the Labour and says something different afterwards. Why, when he was campaigning for leader of the Labour Party, he says he wants to abolish tuition fees, he wants to nationalise everything. Then he gets the job and then chooses to say something different. Compare Rishi Sunak to that, and I think everybody watching tonight knows with Rishi Sunak you have a leader of integrity, vision and seriousness, and I'm afraid Keir Starmer, you can't say the same.
Let's talk about the tone of those questions, because I found it really interesting. It felt to me like it was almost cathartic, that people would just are so annoyed with the government that you are part of, and Rishi Sunak really did have to bear the brunt of that. People feel deeply let down, and a lot of those questions were about trust. Do you think it's possible to repair that?
Look, I think the last 4 or 5 years, because of the impact of COVID and the war in the Ukraine and the economic result of that, has been incredibly difficult for so many people. In addition, the political chaos, and I'm not going to shy away from it, within the Conservative Party, has also contributed to that. Rishi is somebody who's really sought to end both of those periods.
But people are not giving him credit for it, are they? I mean, you heard that really clearly tonight. People over and over again saying, you haven't done this, you've let me down here, I don't trust you on this, I don't believe you on this. I mean, they're just not listening anymore.
I don't think that's right, actually. What I heard this evening, yes, were frustrations from members of the public, but I didn't hear that people said, I don't trust you. I heard people saying, I want to know how you're going to fix these problems.
Well,
that is a subtly different thing.
Let's take the gentleman who raised the issue of children not getting the care they need because the system in the NHS is not working for them, and he said, there are kids being bullied in school because of it, and he was really clearly passionate, very upset about it. He said he felt let down.
Yes, but what he also heard from the Prime Minister are an admission that the Prime Minister said, look, we haven't been as successful as we'd like bringing down waiting lists, and a clear determination and resolve from the Prime Minister to deal with those problems.
I
and deal with
suppose
the
what I'm
backlog.
asking you is a different question, which is that is the Prime Minister's response. But I don't know that the audience were listening to it. I suppose what I'm saying to you is, do you think it's too late?
It's never too late to be honest and truthful with people. It is never too late to set out why you're doing what you're doing with integrity and seriousness. It's never too late to explain how the other person who's competing for the job of Prime Minister, Keir Starmer, his plans don't add up, and he's hiding quite a lot of the tax rises that he has lying in wait for the British people.
Do
It
your
is never
plans-
too late to do any of those things.
Do your plans add up? Because
Yes, they
there was a
definitely do.
moment when Rishi Sunak was asked about national service, and he was asked, how do you force people to do it? Because it will be compulsory. And he seemed a bit lost. If I'm honest, I thought he was a bit lost in that answer. He said, other countries do this, this and this, and we'd look at it. I mean, he seemed to be suggesting you take people's driving licences off them.
Yeah, no, let me explain, because I've myself spoken to colleagues and other ministers about this policy.
You're not going to do that, are you? Take
No,
people's driving
no.
licences off them.
The Royal Commission will look at all the different models we have across Europe. It's important that people listening to this know most countries in Europe have a version of national service.
Yeah.
Right, most countries have it. So we have a lot of experience to draw on from other countries, what works, what doesn't work, and what would suit our own country. What we're not going to do is prejudge all the work of the Royal Commission, beyond to say we'd like something that was compulsory, that had military as an option, only as an option, that enhanced young people's lives and will build skills and opportunities
So
for the
can
future.
you rule
And then
those
we'll
things
allow
out
Royal
then?
Commission.
Can
No, because
you-
that's what you've got to let
so
the
you
Royal
can't
Commission
rule
do.
those things
No.
out. Okay, fine,
And that's
that's
why the
fine.
Prime Minister was saying, well, there are lots sorts of things you can do.
Yeah.
But I think it's really, really important that in this country we are brave enough and strong enough to say, yes, we can ask young people to make a contribution. We can ask them to say, look, being a citizen, when you turn 18, you become, a full adult citizen, comes with rights as well as responsibilities, and that's okay. And I just think it's a brave policy, because it's something that we haven't seen in this country for a very long time, if ever, never in this form. But it's something that works in so many of our partners and friends across the world.
Can I ask you about something that happened while this debate was on air? Chris Skidmore, who, of course, was a former climate change minister, he was absolutely key in all of your climate change policies. He obviously quit the party in January. He was very upset about oil and gas licences, and he made his comments at the time. But today he's come out and said that he will be voting for the Labour Party. That's a former minister in your government, absolutely at the heart of your climate change policies, says your party can't be trusted anymore, so much so that he's going to vote for the others.
Look, I haven't spoken to him for a long time, so I can't speak to his mindset at the moment. What I can say is it is not the action of somebody who has really thought about this properly. And I respect Chris, but he has not understood fundamentally the fact that if we want to do a green transition effectively, which everybody wants to do, and to get to net zero by 2050, in the short term, you are going to need more oil and gas in order to get the critical minerals out of the ground, which you require in order to build your wind turbines or solar panels.
So he's wrong to vote Labour?
Yes, of course he's wrong. And what saddens me is that I fear it's been done for all sorts of other reasons. I don't know what his plans are after politics.
You think he's angling for a job?
I think he probably is, but we'll see. I just think that somebody as intelligent as him really should have thought through the fact that there's a reason why, in order to make the green transition, we're going to need all these critical minerals.
Yeah.
And the only way you do that is with more oil and gas in the short term. And
I've
that's
got
why we
to
need
let
more
you
oil and
go
gas
because, as you
licenses.
know, spin rooms are chaotic and you're going to be rushed off to do
I was
another
enjoying
interview.
this.
Yeah, no, well, I can see you're pepped up and ready to go. So I'm going to ask you one final question.
Okay,
What
go
mark
for
out of
it.
10 would you give the Prime Minister's performance tonight?
8 or 9. I thought it was really strong.
What could he have done to improve? What could he have done to get 2 extra marks out of you?
I'm a tough marker. I don't know ask my kids. They'll tell me it's not really, I don't know. But look, I think that it was a really strong performance. It was the strongest performance of this evening by far. I thought Keir Starmer's team will be very disappointed in that performance. And Ed Davey was even worse.
Bim Afolami, thank you very much for joining us.
Thank you.
That was Bim Afolami
Wow,
there
he was in
giving
punchy form,
his
wasn't he?
views. Yeah, and look, that's what you expect. That's what the spin room is for. You pick up ministers. You are going to speak to Labour. I know you're going to speak to the others too, representatives who will probably tell you that their man did the best. But ultimately, at the end of the day, I do think Bim Afolami is trying to tell us that was a Prime Minister in very strong form. I think there will be others who read that end to that debate as a Prime Minister who was deeply frustrated, I think, by the tone of the questions.
Well, herograms for you all around, Kate McCann. Thank you very much.